Good afternoon once again, and welcome to Heart Talk Between Sisters. We are live streaming from the Caribbean region, and we would like to welcome you to our program this afternoon. We are live streaming on WCAN radio, and we are Heart Talk Between Sisters. We are a program where we share stories, we inspire growth, and we seek to touch the hearts of many to make a positive impact in our community. So, on our program this afternoon, we're going to have a heart talk with yours truly, Alana Wheeler, ranging from the island of Trinidad and Tobago. So, I am so happy to be here with you this afternoon. And I'm happy to be in studio with our dear Dr. Clarence Green. He's the one doing all the technical work on the background. Thank you so much, Dr. Green, for all of the great work that you've been doing. And again, I just want to say a special hello to Michelle in Canada and to my dear friend Elena, who's all the way up in the USA. And sometimes it's just so good to get a little phone call or message to say, Alana, we're tuning in, we're listening in, we're looking out for your program. And somebody actually asked me this week, Alana, you have a podcast? And I was like, well, it's not exactly a podcast. It's an online program that I do. And they're like, okay, well, yes, I've been listening in and everything. So it's really good because this program is all about making a positive impact in our community, and not just our Caribbean community, but all over the world, wherever persons can access the link, the Zeno link, to listen in online. And we hope to have a positive impact in your life and to change things in your life for the better. So what do we have on today? You're wondering, well, what am I going to be talking about, right? Today, this week, incidentally, on the 12th of June, which was Wednesday, was the World Day Against Child Labor. And this is a day that is recognized every year by the International Labor Organization, the ILO. Many countries recognize it all over the world, including here in Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, I do remember being a part of the National Steering Committee for the elimination of child labor in Trinidad and Tobago. That was under the leadership of the Ministry of Labor in our country, Trinidad and Tobago. And they do some very, very good work, and they've been doing some very good work. I was in that committee for a few years, and they've been doing a lot of work on raising awareness about child labor. The Labor Inspectorate here has been doing some excellent work on raising awareness, going out to schools, educating the public on child labor. So we're going to talk about what that is and what that looks like in different parts of the world, focusing mainly, of course, on this region, which is the Latin American and the Caribbean region. And we're going to look at some global data, some global information on it, really. Okay, so again, welcome to Heart Talk Between Sisters. So what is child labor? It's a term we're hearing about all over the place, bandied about, Is it children working in sweatshops, children begging on the streets, children working in a farm? What does it look like? Is it children who, wear dirty clothing and, their faces are dirty with mud and stuff? What does that look like? What really is it? And the ILO, which is the International Labor Organization, they have a definition for child labor. And they define it as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to their physical, mental development, and well-being. So, breaking it down, okay, it's mentally dangerous for a child, physically dangerous, socially dangerous, morally dangerous, and harmful to the child. It interferes with their schooling. It deprives them of the opportunity to attend school. And if they do attend school, it means that they have to now balance school attendance with excessive long and heavy work hours, right? And some of them even drop out of school. So that is what child labor looks like, that type of work. Because we know children are children. And how do we define children? What is the age limit? Children are persons below the age of 18 years. In some countries, when it comes to speaking about work and labor, different countries have different ages as to when a person can start the legal age of employment, basically. So like in Trinidad and in most of the Caribbean countries, the legal age of employment is 16. So any person under age 16 found working, right? Like in employment, being employed, that is actually against the labor laws, right? Now, there's some little fine tuning explanations with respect to that and the ages, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But I'm going to continue talking about this child labor and what it is. So, not all work done by children is classified as child labor. So, you may ask, well, so then if they clean their room and clean the bathroom and clean the yard, is that child labor? No, certainly not, right? Because children need to be doing chores, house chores. What about if the child's family has a business and they help out in the business? Definitely not child labor. Once it does not take away from that child attending school, and once it doesn't take away from them being able to do or their schoolwork and from play and from social life and all those things, right? So they can help out in the family business. They can do things outside of school hours and like on school holidays to make extra pocket money. So July, August holidays are coming up. A lot of teenagers, some of them, they're going to want to work in some of the stores, working in the eating places in the restaurants and everything. That's fine, but of course a child should not be working in a bar, right, selling alcoholic drinks, right? We know that for sure. If a child is found there working in a bar in an environment with alcoholic drinks, then we're talking about violation of certain things, right? Violation of work, violation of a child's rights, and the environment. We now go back to, is that a place that a child will be mentally, socially, and morally fit for a child, right? So those things are not. So these kinds of activities, like helping out in the family business, making money or working outside of school hours during school holidays, all those things help to develop a child, right? And it's for the welfare of the family. So, like in our region, we would see like a lot of Chinese restaurants and Chinese groceries. And sometimes after school hours, you would see the Chinese children are there behind the counter, helping with the cashing or helping with the food in the kitchen and stuff like that. That's fine because sometimes you see them in their school uniform. So after school, they go to where their parents work and they're there helping out until they get home. Sometimes you see them behind the counter actually doing their homework, which is very good, because it's a family business and the parents are there to oversee what they're doing. So you would see quite a bit of that. Sometimes even in the stores and the shops, the small businesses here, you will see the children in their school uniform there at the counter with their relatives or their parents, and they're helping out until the business place closes and they could go home and get things done at home, right? So all those things are important for a child's development. It helps them in their skills and their experience. It helps to prepare them to be productive members of society. So even during the school vacation and on holidays, you find that parents may take their children to the business places and have the children help out in the businesses because the parents are there grooming and preparing their children to take over those businesses eventually. So that is not considered child labor. Once again, it does not take away from their schooling, from their playtime, from their social life. And once it does not bring any harm to that child, whether that harm is mental, physical, social, moral, right? So I've said a mouthful and a handful. Now, if you would like to ask any questions, please feel free to call or WhatsApp or message Clarence Green at 1-678-856-3709. I repeat again, 1-678-856-3709. You can WhatsApp your messages or questions, or you can call and ask if you need any clarification on anything. Right, today it's all about educating and raising awareness about child labor and what child labor is in recognition of World Day Against Child Labor. So let's go on and talk a bit about this whole child labor. So with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, and those of us who are familiar with the United Nations, they have established these wonderful goals. I can't remember how many goals it is, but they've established a certain number of goals that they want countries to accomplish by the year 2025. And some of the goals are by the year 2030. So you would often hear a lot about the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Agenda 2025. So believe it or not, they had this ambitious goal where countries made a commitment to eliminate child labor in all its forms by 2025. Now, what year are we in? We're in the year 2024. So 2025 is just about 6 months away. So, for those listening, I mean, in your countries, we in different countries, we in different parts of the world. Is that really realistic? Is that really practical? Is that even possible to eliminate child labor in the next 6 months or even in the next year? And it's a big no, not possible. Unless God comes and God intervenes supernaturally into the affairs of nations and he can change those things with the snap of a finger. We know how powerful Almighty God is. All right. But looking at the way things have been going in the world and what's been happening, we see that it is more than likely not going to happen that child labor is going to be eliminated, right, by that time. So right now they'd say that the world is not on track to eliminate child labor by 2025, right? Because in order to meet this target, as you know, the globalists will say you need to do 18 times faster than what we're doing right now to be able to do that. And even, when we look at, is it that what countries are doing is having any success? I would say very little success we're seeing with what countries are doing to eliminate child labor, right? We're not talking about combating child labor or fighting against child labor. We want to eliminate it completely, right? And as I said before, there is only one way that that can be eliminated. Only if God Almighty comes, right, and puts his hand upon our nations. And in the snap of a finger, God could take these evil things away from our nations, right? So this year's World Day Against Child Labor, I'm going to move on to see what are they recognizing. And every year they tend to recognize different things. So I remember a couple of years ago when I was part of the National Steering Committee in Trinidad and Tobago, we actually had I think it was a video competition or a song competition where the young people had to actually either write a song or a poem or spoken word, I can't recall. And they had to make the submissions, and I was on the panel to judge the submissions, and we got some very, very good submissions from some of the young people in the schools. And so that was one way of recognizing it and raising awareness among the young people. I think now in Trinidad they have what you call these child labor ambassadors, where they're selected persons in different high schools, and they go and they raise awareness about child labor in the schools among the young people. Because with young people, when you hear from your own, it's a different kind of reception than an older person or a more mature person coming to say something to the young persons. So it's been recognized in different ways all over the world. Jamaica has done things, Belize has done things in this part of the world, in the African countries. Different activities have taken place to raise awareness. So I even remember going to see a production in a school in far central in Trinidad. Central, and I mean the center, literally the center of Trinidad and Tobago, right? I think it may have been in Tabaquite, right? Where I went to a school and we actually witnessed this school did an entire wall. It was like a walkway, and along the walls they had messages about child labor, different messages done with art and drawings and paintings. They did skits, they did songs, they did so many things to send the message and to get the message out there to young people. So it's really important to mobilize the youth when it comes to getting the message out there. So this year is actually 25th anniversary of the adoption of Convention number 182, which is an ILO convention. And this ILO convention talks about the worst forms of child labor, right? So we're getting a little thing. So we had child labor, we saw what it was. Now we're getting into the worst forms of child labor. What is that? Right? Well, the ILO, that's the International Labor Organization, they have all these conventions, just like the UN has all these conventions, the ILO has all these conventions, and they ask states, they ask countries to sign on to these conventions, ratify them, implement them in laws and everything. So this worst forms of child labor convention is also called convention number 182, right? And so 25 years, it's been 25 years since this convention was signed by states, the UN member states, and it's been ratified. So, what progress has been made over those 25 years? Well, some countries have committees that have been set up to look at child labor. Many countries pass domestic laws in line with child labor and the rights of the child. But have we actually eliminated it? No. In fact, child labor has increased. And when you look at the last, I think it was the last UNICEF report, it's actually said that child labor increased in most of the regions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, whereas in Latin America and the Caribbean, it actually reduced a bit, over the past 20 years. But, I will stick a pin there and I would say the numbers don't lie, but also we have to also consider the reporting of these cases, because even though we might see numbers or statistics being reduced, does it mean that the problem is lessened or the problem is less? No, it could be that there's less reporting of the problem. It could be that there needs to be more awareness raising about the problem, right? So that persons can know and recognize, well, hey, this is child labor. Because I could tell you, before I was on that committee, and prior to that period of time, I really did not know what child labor was. I didn't even know the terminology really, that you actually have children who are in situations like this. So it was very alien to me until I became involved in committees and at the national level, being educated and helping me to understand what it really is. And I'm so thankful for the Labor Inspectorate Unit and the ministries of labor all over the world that really help to educate the population on what this is all about. So moving along, so this year's child labor is focusing on that anniversary of the adoption of that convention. There is also another convention that deals with children, and that is called the Convention number 138 concerning the minimum age for admission to employment or work. All right. Many countries have adopted it. And when we say adopted, we mean they've signed and they've ratified it and they have tried to incorporate it into the domestic laws. All right. So here we have a focus on these two conventions because, you must have checks and balances to know how a country is really measuring performance on dealing with these conventions and aligning with these conventions. How are we doing? If we were to rate ourselves, how are we doing? So that's what it's all about this year, looking at that. So the World Day Against Child Labor, which was celebrated on the 12th of June, this is a statement that was given by the ILO with respect to what they would want to see happening. The effective implementation of the ILO Convention number 182 on the worst forms of child labor. They would like to see reinvigorated national, regional, and international action to end child labor in all its forms, including the worst forms, through adopting national policies and addressing root causes as called upon in the 2022 Durban Call to Action. They would like to see a universal ratification and effective implementation of the ILO Convention number 138 on the minimum age, which together with the universal ratification of ILO Convention number 182 on the worst forms of child labor, achieved in 2020, would provide all children with legal protection against all forms of child labor. So this is the declaration that was made in recognition of this year's World Day Against Child Labor. So we see so many countries trying to make effort, right? So as we get into that, we're going to just take a little break. We'll be right back in a few minutes.
Yes, girl. Online here with this weirdo named Larry. I'm getting rid of him now. Let's take a selfie. It looking good, boy. I putting it online.
Hey, I thought you say you went to the beach with your parents.
Who's you?
It's me, Larry, from online.
Thank you again for joining us on Heart Talk Between Sisters, where we are sharing stories and empowering lives. And today's meeting again, today's session again is on the theme of ending child labor. Let's act on our commitments in recognition of World Day Against Child Labor, which was recognized by the world on Wednesday, the 12th of June of this week. So I just mentioned what the statement is, the global statement with respect to the World Day Against Child Labor 2024. And now we're going to look at some global child labor facts according to the ILO. So roughly 160 million children were subjected to child labor at the beginning of 2020. Now we remember the COVID-19 hit our countries in 2020. So this is before COVID-19. We had 160 million children. And what they're saying is that 9 million additional children were at risk because of the impact of COVID-19. Because we know with the COVID-19 and all the restrictions, children were at home, schools were closed, workplaces were closed, all physical activity was banned in many of the countries. Overseas travel, borders were closed. So all the things that children can do by way of play, social life, education, everything was restricted to indoors and to online. So, and also we had many families where the main breadwinners lost their jobs or they passed away because of the COVID-19. So we had situations happening in families where families and the family unit actually became more vulnerable because of the effects of the COVID-19, the adverse effects and the impact it had on families. So whereas prior to COVID-19, you had 160 million children. I can't imagine what 160 million looks like because the population in Trinidad and Tobago is just about 1.3 million. So that will be 160 times our population. That's a lot of people, right? Maybe in some of the countries where you come from, those of you who are listening, you can picture what 160 million people would look like, but that's the number of children subjected to child labor. And those again are only the reported cases, right? So then another fact from the ILO is that nearly 1 in 10 children are subjected to child labor worldwide, with some forced into hazardous work through trafficking. And we're going to get to talk a little bit about trafficking in children or child trafficking, right? That's where we get into the worst forms of child labor. So when we say hazardous work also, I just want to give you some examples because earlier, before we went on the break, I had mentioned that any work that was mentally, physically, socially, or morally dangerous and harmful to a child is considered child labor. So talking about that and hazardous work, some examples of that are like if you expose a child to an environment where they're working with chemicals. So it's not just about the child working in an environment like that, but actually having a child in an environment where it is actually dangerous and harmful to them. So exposing them to a work environment or an environment where there are strong chemicals. So like in factories, in any of those, buildings or organizations where there are harsh chemicals, exposing a child even to places where there is electricity and electrical wires that are loose. So I do remember a case we had in Trinidad. Well, it wasn't really a case, but it was all over the news where there was a 14-year-old boy who was, I think he was executed. Now, this is during school hours. And he was executed because he was trying to climb a fence to steal copper wires, right? And he got executed because there was some loose electrical wire or something like that. So many questions are asked. Number one, what was a 14-year-old doing working? Because he was actually working for a contractor and they were stealing copper wire, right? What was he doing working? Number one. What was he doing out of school? Number two. And then number three, the type of environment that was a hazardous environment to have a child in, or to have anybody in, but more so a child, right? So that's an example of really what a hazardous, a dangerous environment is. You also have, as I mentioned earlier, children who they are found in bars where alcohol is sold, children who are in environments where there is prostitution taking place, prostitution or commercial sexual activity taking place, children who are exposed to pornographic or sexual materials, whether they by eyes or by ears. That is a type of abuse of a child, right? And exploiting a child, putting a child in a hazardous environment, and so we'll get into some more examples after. So I just thought I would pause and just explain that a little bit. So one of the other global facts, right, by the ILO is that almost half of the children who are found in child labor are found in hazardous work that directly endangers their health and their development. And you do find children working in sweatshops and factories. You find children in the Asian and the African countries. They are working in these mines and fields where they're digging for gold or they're digging for heavy metal, or sometimes they're making bricks. And making bricks is very dangerous because these children are barefoot. They're exposed to things like sulfur and ashes and charcoal and all these things, and they don't have masks on, or they don't have gloves, or they don't have shoes on and stuff. So all these things get into their blood system, right? And it affects them. So that's a hazardous condition. First of all, a child should not be there. Worse yet, a child working in that kind of space, right? So sadly, we do have children in those environments. So another fact is that child labor is more prevalent among boys than girls at every age, and that's all over the world. The agricultural sector accounts for the largest share of child labor worldwide. So, you see them working on farms, they're in the heat, extreme heat. Again, they're exposed to the chemicals, the fertilizers, and all these agricultural pesticides and all these things, chemicals. Sometimes they don't have shoes on. They're walking through muddy patches, depending on what the agricultural product is. And they are for long hours outside, exposed to the sun and exposed to harsh weather conditions, working on these farms and working for long hours, right? So another fact is over 1/3 of children in child labor are out of school. And I mentioned that earlier, that, many times, because a child is a child, and a child really should be afforded the opportunity to attend school, whether it's online or in person, for play, and time to socialize with other children, because a child is still at this stage of development, physical development, mental, emotional, psychological development, even spiritual development, right? Children are at that stage, and so they need to be allowed that space and that time to grow. So when they are forced into conditions where they into adult-like conditions or adult living conditions where they have to almost like become an adult, and still being a child, it's really a very traumatic experience for a child to have to go through that, so they really should be in school among persons of their own age or age group and learning from each other and learning in a teaching sort of environment. So another fact, world fact, child labor can result in extreme bodily and mental harm and even death. And I think some of the examples I explained earlier sort of says it all, right? Lots of chemicals, strong chemicals, electrical wires, electrocution. If they're in a place where alcohol is served, where there's commercial sexual activity taking place, even places where you have children, where there are weapons, arms, and ammunition. So a parent may be involved in gun trafficking, or arms and ammunition trafficking, right? Or smuggling. And their child, their son or their daughter is there. So the weapons are on display on the table, the dining table, or in the living room, or on the bed in the bedroom. And the child is seeing all of that happening, witnessing all that transaction taking place. Even persons coming to buy, even drugs, cocaine, marijuana, meth, ecstasy, all these drugs that are being prepared in the home, right? Because some of them could be prepared in homes in the kitchen stove, and a child is exposed to all of that. That's dangerous for a child. If there was to be an explosion, if there was to be a gunfight, if there was to be a hold up in the house or by the home by somebody who is owing money, or that child is definitely put at risk. Gangs, child is put at risk for gangs. So here we have child labor resulting in extreme bodily and mental harm and even death. So, another world fact, it can lead to slavery and sexual or economic exploitation. And in nearly every case, it cuts children off from schooling and healthcare, restricting their fundamental rights. So here we have where child labor can actually progress or cross over into slavery or slave-like conditions and sexual or economic exploitation of that child, right? And I have to stress, it may not necessarily just be sexual, it can be the slave-like conditions, because if the children are being forced into these things, forced to do these things because they have an obligation to their parents, or they have an obligation to their relatives, or they don't have a choice, right? And I mean, children cannot choose, but they are confined or they are imprisoned in some way, and they cannot leave, they cannot run away. Then certainly here is where we talk about the slave-like sort of conditions, right? So we are going to another part which is really, really very important. And it's an important part in my part of the world, this part of the world, the Caribbean, Latin American region, because we're seeing a lot of it. We're seeing a lot of it all over the world. We're seeing it from the African continent into through into Egypt, into Greece, into Italy. We are seeing it all over the world. So we're talking about migrant and refugee children, right? Migrant and refugee children, also referred to as children on the move, also referred to as displaced children. These types of children, and this is actually mentioned in the global child labor facts, right? That these persons who have been children who have been uprooted by conflict, they've been uprooted because of poverty, they've been uprooted because of some natural disaster or even wars, right? They are at risk of being forced into work and forced and being trafficked, right? Especially if they are migrating alone or if they are taking irregular routes with their families. In other words, they may be crossing borders illegally, entering other countries, leaving their country illegally and entering other countries illegally, without papers, without visas, without passports, without any documents, right? So these are the ones that are very, very vulnerable to being forced into work and into child labor and child trafficking conditions. And we see so many examples of that all over the world. Later on in the program, we are going to listen to a situation in that's happening in the Latin American and Caribbean region with respect to the migrant and refugee children, or children on the move, right? They call them that. So children can be displaced across borders, or they can be displaced internally, so within a country. Because of whatever is happening within that country, they can be displaced or forced to move from one part of the country to another part of the country. There might be war taking place. There might have been a natural disaster that took place in one part, and they are forced into moving because their home was destroyed. Soldiers have taken over their home or their city or their town, and they had to flee for some reason, right? So that's what you call children who have been displaced. Now, sadly, a lot of times, some of these children end up getting separated from their family members, because if it's madness taking place, as they say, right, and you just have to pick up what you have and run and flee. So, for example, a bomb drops on your house suddenly, and bam, big explosion, you're gone. You just have to run to a safe place and run for shelter. So you're hardly going to stop and look behind, right? So in cases like that, and in many other cases, these children are separated from their parents or separated from their relatives. And sometimes the relatives or parents end up dying, and the child is left an orphan or without one of the parents, and they can't find the other parent, you know? So these are cases where you call them separated children, or sometimes children even leave their family behind. So, and we're looking at more like the teenagers, right? The older teens, let's say 16, 17, 15, even 14, they may decide, well, you know what? I am young and I'm fit and I could go and look for work. Mom and dad, you stay behind. Grandma, grandpa, you stay behind because you won't be able to make this journey. This journey is going to be too hard for you. So let me try and make the journey and go across or go somewhere else, try to find work, and I'll send money back for you. So that's what you find some children, because they're still children. Remember, we said under age 18 is considered a child. That is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's the definition of a child under age 18. So that child or teenager ends up going to look for work. So they end up being unaccompanied, without a parent, without any relative or any legal guardian, right? So they're on the move on their own, basically. So we have that. And I remember in one of our interviews a couple of weeks ago, and that's my dear sister Michelle from Canada. I thank her so much that she actually did 2 interviews on our program. And if you want to access Michelle's interview, you could find it on the Bijou Caribbean Connect YouTube channel. That's Bijou, Bijou, Caribbean Connect YouTube channel. You could find Michelle's interview part 1 and part 2. And you'll see all the other interviews that I would have done on this program. But I singled out Michelle because Michelle's story is so powerful and so amazing. You know, Michelle was a migrant in Canada. So here, we have in Trinidad and Tobago, usually we find it's the foreigner that comes in, and the foreigner, sometimes they end up being exploited. But here you had a Trinidad and Tobago national leaving Trinidad legally, legally with her passport, with her mother, accompanied by her mother, right, to legally migrate to Canada, right? And then ending up being exploited, ending up in a situation of child sex trafficking and other types of trafficking, abuse, and all these other things, right? So that is one example of where you can actually have the worst forms. We call that the worst forms of child labor, right? Michelle's case is an example of that. As I said, listen to it on the YouTube channel, Bijou Caribbean Connect, and you will get her full story of what Michelle experienced. But I wanted to reference her story because it is so powerful what she experienced and what she was subjected to. And listen to this. I mean, I'm just gonna talk about a little bit. Her mom, from Michelle's story, was forced into marriage at age 16. So that's still a child. And then the mom gave birth to Michelle when the mom was 17 years old, right? Left their family in Trinidad and Tobago, so left a comfortable home in Trinidad to migrate for a better life, because that's why we migrate, that's why we move, right? But when you move to a strange land, you don't always end up in your own home or your own place. You oftentimes end up staying by family until you could help yourself. And so they stayed in their home. Michelle stayed with her family. They didn't have their own home, and she was there until they were able to move out on their own and have their own place. So, Michelle described it as she and her mom were like sitting targets in Canada as migrants. And I found that was so powerful because it's so depicting of what migrants on the move go through. And they are regularized migrants, legal, but they were like sitting targets as migrants, right? So Michelle talked about the importance of a father in a child's life. Michelle's traumatic experiences began around age 8 years of age, So from the age of 8 years to about the age of 12 years, these are the formative years of a human being. 8 to 12 years, she was subjected to extremely traumatic experiences, you know, as a regular migrant, a legal migrant. So we haven't even reached talking about irregular migrants yet, and ended up being trafficked by a relative. So Michelle spoke about some things like, in exchange for the experience. So we are going to take a little break right here, and we'll get right back to you to talk some further about Michelle.
Go, sona. I come in. And don't give me no attitude there.
You have shit no manners, boy. I wish I had your touch, boy.
You have to groom them. First, you have to target them. Scope them out. See if they have low self-esteem. Family problems, you know? Then you move in and gain the trust.
I like your glasses.
After that, you feel a need. Some of them like nice things like fancy phones, hairdos, clothes, food. It have ones who only looking for somebody to care and listen to their problems. You feel me? What's important though, you have to isolate them from the people. Let them believe it's all about you
Forget
and
me.
them.
I care about you.
Then you get through.
Nice, nice.
Look one right here. Try thing now.
A message from the counter-trafficking unit of the Ministry of National Security.
Thank you for joining us again on Heart Talk Between Sisters, where we are sharing stories and empowering lives. And today, again, we are discussing child labor in recognition of the World Day Against Child Labor, a day that's recognized by the international community. So I was talking about the worst forms of child labor and talking about one of our previous interviews that we did with Michelle from Canada. And Michelle spoke about what she had received in exchange for being exploited or being subjected to the worst forms of child labor. She received toys, books, candy. So there was no money, there was no monetary exchange. Toys, books, and candy, because that's what children love. So we might look at that and we might think, well, oh, that's not child trafficking, or that's not human trafficking, and that's not worst forms of child labor, right? Because she didn't get any money and no money was exchanged. But it was something of value that was exchanged. There was a benefit. There was a benefit gained from exploiting her. Toys, books, candy, right? So Michelle's story is interesting. She also went on to talk about child sexual abuse material that, was out there and how that impacted her life as an adult. So, here we have one example of what that looks like. So I'm going to move on to talk about what this is now. So we have another global fact. For girls, the triple burden of school, work, and household chores heightens their risk of falling behind, making them even more vulnerable to poverty and exclusion. And, when we talk about girls in particular, girls are the ones that they say they are the ones in the kitchen and they do the cooking and the cleaning and the housework and all of that and stuff. So here you have a girl child. She is subjected to child labor, and she still has to balance somehow schoolwork and being a child with having to work. And that's really difficult. So they call it, this triple burden sort of thing. School, work, household chores. How can any child be subjected to that? And I do remember the story of Sarah. Sarah was she was the first child victim of trafficking identified in Trinidad and Tobago under the TIPS Act. And her case was the first case that got a conviction in Trinidad and Tobago, right? And she was subjected to child trafficking, child sex trafficking as a teenager. She was 16 years old, right? And one of the things I remember she said in her story was that, because of her family situation, she was one of many siblings. The mother had to see about the other younger siblings. And so she moved out, went to live with this adult boyfriend, and had this burden and responsibility of seeing about a home, having to cook and clean and wash and all these things at age 15, and then having to go out and work. She eventually dropped out of school because her boyfriend fell ill, and she now had to become the breadwinner in the home at age 15 with an adult boyfriend. And she was working at a grocery store on weekends, and then those weekends turned into weekdays, and eventually, of course, that was it for her schooling. So she never got to finish high school until when she came under the care of the state, and then the state paid for her to finish her high school and get her high school certification and everything. So that is also an example of child labor. So you see how the child labor can progress to become worse forms of child labor and to become trafficking, right? Child trafficking. So what is the worst forms of child labor? Worst forms of child labor is all forms of slavery or practices similar to slavery, such as the sale and trafficking of children, debt bondage, servitude, forced labor. We talk about that. Even recruiting children in armed conflict. And we see some of that happening with the gangs, where the gangs are recruiting children. Gangs recruiting children to fight. That's a type of trafficking, because a child can't consent to joining a gang. Then we have children being recruited to join armies in the African continent and stuff. We see a lot of that, child soldiers. We've seen that with children fighting for ISIS and stuff. A lot of children recruited, right, by these terrorist organizations. So we also have the use, procuring, or offering of a child for prostitution. That is the worst forms of child labor. And for the production of pornography or for pornographic performances. And another term that's used to call that is CSAM, which is child sexual abuse material. The use, procuring, or offering of a child for illicit activities, in particular for the production and trafficking of drugs, as defined in the treaties. So you can give a child marijuana, cocaine, whatever, to transport and say, hey, drop this off by so-and-so, or collect money from so-and-so as payment, right? So that is engaging the child in illicit activity. They're basically selling illegal drugs. You could also do it also with them selling illegal arms and ammunition. Because of course, if the authorities, they would hardly stop a child to search a child if, in a neighborhood, if there's a stop and search taking place in a neighborhood or police patrolling, they are hardly likely to stop a child. Right? So it's easy to send that child with the illegal drugs, with the illegal arms and ammunition, to drop it off to the buyer or to transport it in some way. Right? So any work which by nature of the circumstances is carried out is likely to harm the health, safety, or morals of the child. That is considered worst forms of child labor. So when we talk about children on the move, and we're going to get to the video in a little while, we talk about children who often miss out on education and proper medical care, because you have children, as I said, children on the move are displaced children, or they are migrant or refugee children that are crossing borders. So their time is spent walking in very dangerous routes or on the boat, right, traveling on very dangerous routes. They don't have time for school and they don't have time for medical care. They don't even have money for that. They don't find it easy to feel at home in the communities they arrive in. So when they arrive in some strange community, sometimes they don't speak the language, they don't understand the culture, they don't know the culture. And so, you've now displaced a child and put them in an environment that they're not familiar with and they're not accustomed to. These children on the move, they try to learn a new language, they try to fit into a new culture. And that's very hard for a child to do. It's even hard for an adult to do. Because we as adults, when we go, if we are English speakers and we visit a Spanish-speaking country, or a French-speaking country, or a country that speaks some other type of language, Greece or Italy or something, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, Dutch, Holland, we go there and they're speaking gibberish. We don't understand what they're saying. And we now have to adjust to that space, because I'm now working here. I now live here. I migrated here. I married someone who's from here. And this is my life now, and I have to adjust and adapt. So for adults, it's very difficult. So far less for children, right? So it's difficult. It's difficult physically. It's difficult psychologically for certain children when they're on the move to actually reach their full potential, because they're always in this state. They're always in a state of an in limbo kind of state, because they're not sure what's the next move. They're not sure what's next for them because they've been displaced, right, from their home. So narrowing down now to the Latin American and the Caribbean region, we do have child labor in Jamaica. And, it's said the Jamaican authorities have said that child labor has cultural roots in that country. In the case of Barbados, there was a case last year where Barbados investigated a viral video of a child working as a maxi taxi conductor. So now to break it down for the people who don't know what that is, a maxi taxi in the Caribbean is like a mini bus that operates as a taxi service. So you usually have a conductor, which is the person who opens and closes the doors for the passengers, and they also collect the money for the passenger, because in the minibus it could seat about 12 to 15 persons, and the driver at the front may not be able to always monitor who is entering and who is leaving. So he hires what you call a conductor, who sits at the back and who will collect that money and who will open and close the door. So you have a child working as a maxi taxi conductor, which number one is dangerous because they're jumping in and out of this minibus. And number two, you have them exposed to adults, right? And having to collect money from adults. So Barbados was investigating a case like that. Then you have Haiti, where we have the rest of X, which is like the child domestic workers. And we see that not just in Haiti, we actually see that in some of the other countries in the Caribbean, right? Belize, Jamaica. It happens where you hand over your child to a family, another family, because you're not able to take care of them. And you hand them over to a family who will give them a better life, who will see about them and their schooling and everything. And instead of that family sending them to school, that family ends up using them as a domestic worker to clean the house, to cook, to do all these different things, right? So you see some of that happening. Then in the first 4 months of 2024, according to, I think this is a UNICEF report, more than 30,000 children on the move crossed an area called the Darien Gap. The Darien Gap is a jungle between Colombia and Panama. So if you look at a map of the world, a map of South America, you will see Colombia is on the northwestern side of South America, and Colombia joins into Panama, right? That little thing in Central America. And there is this jungle, heavily forested jungle area called the Darien Gap. And a lot of persons have been migrating from South America and going through the Darien Gap through Central America, heading towards the United States of America. You also have persons coming from Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and the African countries coming into South America and then going up through the Darien Gap. So here we have 30,000 children on the move crossing that in the first 4 months of this year, 2024, which is a 40% increase compared to the same period last year. So children comprise 1/5 of the persons who crossed that Darien Gap. And of the 30,000 children on the move so far for this year, about 2,000 of those 30,000 children, they are unaccompanied and separated from their families. So here you have 2,000 children this year alone. The number of unaccompanied and separated children tripled in comparison to the same period in 2023, which was last year. So now we're going to listen in to a little thing on what this Darien Gap is all about. So I'm going to ask Dr. Clarence Green, to just play that audio clip for us, please.
Esta es la habitación. Duerme mi esposa y mis 2 hijos.
John Carlos Molina, his wife Rosemary, and their 10-year-old twins sleep on this beach in Necoclí, Colombia. The twins caught chickenpox here. The marks are still on their face and arms. While sick, the children begged their parents to leave this place. Why aren't we going to the jungle, Mom asks. Because we don't have money, her son answers. After a month living like this, they began to sell coffee to other migrants. They save little by little, with cups that cost 25 cents, plus cigarettes and candy. Food is often an afterthought.
Sometimes to save, because eating here is expensive. We try to eat very little. The kids eat well, but we try to cut down. Not to mention, there is the worry, the stress, work.
They don't have enough cash to continue on through the Darien Gap, a dense stretch of jungle that migrants must pay $350 to cross in order to reach Panama and continue north toward the United States border. Panamanian authorities estimate more than 113,000 children crossed the Darien Gap last year. Children are more vulnerable to the health risks of migration and living outdoors with limited access to hygiene and clean water. On Necoclee's beaches, it's in plain view. Skin rashes, sunburn, infections, diarrhea, and respiratory viruses are also common. VOA went with Red Cross staff as they evaluated the cases of children living on the sand.
Try to give him the medicine as it indicates there on the medical formula, okay? If you see there's no improvement, take him in again.
The Red Cross estimates its workers attended to nearly 6,000 children here in 2023. And that's before the jungle, where organizations have no reach. At least 13 children died or went missing in the gap in 2022, according to the International Organization on Migration.
In the
jungle, these people find highly dangerous animals. Also people who seek trafficking or are perhaps outside the law or recruiting boys and girls.
Elsewhere on the beach, David Diaz and Flor Rodriguez accept a ticket for their 3 kids to eat lunch that day at a small kitchen run by a charity in town. They're 11, 5, and 1-year-old. An organization called Compartir, which in Spanish means to share, works with local Catholic nuns to offer meals twice a week. Children go first, as other hungry people wait eagerly in line. They can only serve about 150 people because funding is limited. Diaz and Rodriguez left Venezuela just 5 months ago. He worked as a radio broadcaster for various stations, but earned about $10 a month, not enough to buy food. They know this trip in the jungle could be risky with young children. At night, the family sets up their tent, one for all 5 of them. They also don't have enough money to continue and say they might go back to the big city of Medellin to work, then try again. In the morning, hundreds of others pack up their tents, their belongings and cell phones in plastic. They board boats to cross over to the jungle. Their passage is already paid to smugglers who will guide them through the Darien Gap and onward toward the United States. Austin Landis, VOA News, Necoclí, Colombia.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Green, and we do apologize for that slight glitch in the technical difficulty. And so we see that was Voice of America giving a report, a recent report on what's happening in the Darien Gap, and we spoke about children on the move, right? Migrant and refugee children. This is some of the things that they have been subjected to, and this is just one example of what's happening in the Latin American and the Caribbean region. So we're coming down to a landing. And so the minimum age for employment in Trinidad and Tobago is 16 years, right? So otherwise it's illegal to employ a child under the age of 16. And if you do employ children that are between ages 16 and 18, the employers are required to keep a special register for young persons. So this is one example of how countries manage the employment of children or teenagers. You could say teenagers, right? Persons under 18. So I just wanted to stick that in respect to Trinidad and Tobago. I think in some countries, the working age may be 14 in some countries. And even in some countries, the marital age, like in Trinidad, the marital age was, I think, 12 or 13 years. And a couple of years ago, it was raised to 18 years of age. So you find countries taking action to really treat with the whole issue of abusing and exploiting children and violating the rights of children. So I'm going to read a statement from the UNICEF. UNICEF, we know, is a UN agency that treats with all matters affecting children. A child is a child, no matter why she leaves home, where she comes from, where she is, or how she got there. Every child has the right to protection, care, and all the support and services they need to thrive. Children should be safe from violence and be able to grow up with their families. They shouldn't have to miss school or be scared to visit a doctor. They shouldn't be discriminated against because of where they came from, so xenophobia. They should be allowed to feel at home wherever they find themselves and wherever home is. So on that note, I would like to thank you so much for listening in and tuning in to Heart Talk Between Sisters. And if you wish to view or listen to this program, today's program, or any of our previous programs on Heart Talk Between Sisters, please check out the YouTube channel Bijou Caribbean Connect. And please feel free, if you wish to make a contribution or a donation in any way to sponsor our program, we also invite you to do so. And so we thank you again for joining us, and join us next week again for Heart Talk Between Sisters. Have a wonderful weekend. God's blessings to you all. And I pray for every child that is listening to this program and every household that has children in this program. I pray for God's grace, God's protection, and God's guidance over your lives. In Jesus' mighty name, amen.
Put on my makeup, slide on my shoes. Remember the times I could only cherish.
If you know of or suspect human trafficking activity, call 800-4CTU, 800-4288. Human trafficking is a serious crime. Identify it, report it, stop it. A message from the Counter-Trafficking Unit of the Ministry of National Security.